On this channel I've featured some of the greatest literary works ever created, towering monuments to human genius such as the epics of Homer. But I'd hate anyone to think that I was an elitist or anything, so to balance things out a bit, I thought I'd make a video about Calpurnius Siculus. Welcome to Ancient Classics. Calpurnius is the author of 7 eclogues or pastoral poems about sheep and peasants and stuff. His poems were transmitted from ancient to modern times via the manuscript tradition, and most of the manuscripts have his poems alongside 4 others, which are now almost universally attributed to Nemesianus. Calpurnius' date is unknown, or rather it's disputed. He's usually placed in the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, i.e. mid-1st century AD, or in the 3rd century AD. Either way, there is little doubt that Calpurnius comes after Virgil. Calpurnius' poetry is, one might say, a pathetically pale imitation of Virgil's Eclogues, and his inferiority only becomes clearer whenever one holds him up to his Virgilian model as a mirror. So, let's take a look at his first eclogue, and I'll see if I can bear to do any others.
The waning summer has not yet tamed the horses of the sun. Even so, the presses crush the juicy grapes, and the fermenting grape juice foams and gurgles. Do you see, Ornitus, how the cows, which father entrusted to you, gently rest their flanks upon the rough undergrowth? Why don't we too take cover in the shade nearby? Why shade our sunburnt faces with just a cap?
Corydon, my brother, let's instead make for the grove and the caves of Father Faunus, where the pine forest spreads thick with its delicate needles and raises its head to meet the full force of the sun, where the beech tree covers the bubbling waters beneath its roots and casts shadows with its waving branches.
So the poem starts as a dialogue between 2 characters, and that's typical for the genre. Those characters are called Corydon and Ornitus. They're young herdsmen. Ornitus calls Corydon brother, and many of the commentaries take it for granted that they are actual brothers, but who knows or cares? The scene opens on a torrid summer's day, but Ornitus seems to suggest that the brothers retire to a nice spot under the shade of trees by a bubbling stream, a classic locus amoenus, one of the many commonplaces of the pastoral tradition. But more specifically, this locus amoenus is sacred to the god Faunus. The reference to Faunus is significant. He's a Roman rustic god, or by some accounts a pre-Roman Latin king, native to Rome or to its neighbouring regions. As Ovid puts it in Book 2 of the Fasti, Romani numen soli, a divinity of the Roman soil. As so many of the Roman gods were, Faunus became associated with a Greek counterpart god, the god Pan. Pan is of course famous for his panpipe moods and other such atrocities. But the Faunus of this poem is very much the native Roman Faunus, god of the Italian woods and grottos, not of the Arcadian mountainsides.
I'll follow where you call me, Ornitus. For so long as my Luca denies my embrace and nighttime pleasures, she makes it lawful for me to enter the shrine of horny Faunus. So fetch a reed pipes, and whatever it is you've been saving for the occasion. On my part, my pipe, which skilful Leyden made for me out of an old reed, well, that won't disappoint.
Okay, now we've reached the shades we were aiming for. But hey, what's that text inscribed on the holy beech tree? No idea who wrote that or how. I guess with some kind of quick scratching scythe. Do you notice how the writing still preserves the sappy green scratches and hasn't become a dry crusty gape?
Another convention of the genre. Our 2 herdsmen are musical herdsmen, players of pipes, reed instruments specifically, rather than panpipes, thank God. But when they reach Faunus's grove, they see an inscription carved into a tree.
You take a closer look, Ornitus, as you can more readily read the verses inscribed deep in the bark, for your legs are sufficiently long, inherited from lanky father, nor did mother begrudge you a generous figure. This is not the work of a shepherd, nor some passers-by's casual scrawl, nor the song of the cowshed, nor does this song bear the marks of mountain yodels. Rather a god himself sings. Then you speak of marvels. Without further ado, read with your scanning eyes the divine song for us right away.
So, the herdsmen surmise that the inscription on the tree is a song or a poem, a composition by the god Faunus himself, and Corydon asks Ornitus to read it aloud to him. We have to suspend our disbelief, of course, not only that a god would write a poem on a tree, but that the two herdsmen from ancient Italy would be able to read it at all, but this is pastoral poetry. It's anything but realistic. And this scene, two young herdsmen discovering and then reciting the written song of a god, combines at least two tropes or cliches of the pastoral tradition: the discovery or capture of a god in his song, and the song as a written, embodied text. For the former, the discovery or capture of a song, the locus classicus, and surely a key inspiration of this poem, is the Song of Silenus from Virgil's 6th Eclogue, which I featured in a video way back about 2 years ago. In Virgil's 6th Eclogue, two herdsmen come across the god Silenus drunk and asleep in a cave and force him to sing. Another example of this trope, which was also featured in that same video, is the Song of Pan. Pan himself, that is, not Faunus, in Nemesianus' 4th Eclogue. But of course, rather than finding a god and forcing him to sing, the herdsmen in this poem find his written song and read it out. Yes, it's all very meta, as the kids say. More on that later. The concept of written text as a physical object is found elsewhere in Calpurnius. In his 3rd Eclogue, he features a poem written upon a tree, in that instance by a herdsman himself. Now, you might think the idea of writing a whole poem on a tree is rather preposterous, and yeah, it is, but it's one of the cliches of the pastoral tradition. I'm reminded here of Rosenmeyer's withering comment: "Nothing could be clearer evidence of the loss of purity and plain confusion which befell the pastoral than this self-defeating attack upon the surface of trees." So Calpurnius has combined, perhaps for the first time, the tropes of the captured gods and his song and the inscribed poem. Yay, Calpurnius, but does he pull it off? Nothing for it but to read the entire song of Faunus. I, Faunus, skyborn, who watches over the mountains and woods, I sing to the people of these things to come. It pleases me to carve these joyous songs upon my sacred tree, with the fates made manifest. Rejoice, ye who dwell in the forests. Rejoice, ye people of mine. May now the whole herd wander their guardian free from worry. May the herdsman care not to close the pens at night with ashwood gate. And yet the bandit may not lay traps for the sheep, nor shall he release the beasts of burden from their bonds and drive them away. For a golden age is reborn, with undisturbed peace. At last, bounteous Themis has forsaken foulness and decay and returns to the land. These propitious times follow in the footsteps of a young man, he who won a Julian maternal suit. Already, Calpurnius is integrating another Virgilian model, another trope of the pastoral tradition into this written song of Faunus, the prophecy of a coming golden age. The Virgilian model is Virgil's 4th Eclogue, which is sometimes known as the Messianic Eclogue. Virgil was writing just a few years before the birth of Christ, so you can imagine how early Christian commentators latched on to Virgil's poem about the birth of a child who would usher in a golden age. But wait, there's another Virgilian allusion buried in here too. Virgil's 4th Eclogue prophesies a golden age whose coming is heralded in by the birth of a baby boy. But in Calpurnius' Song of Faunus, the new age follows the arrival of a young man, a amoenus, who's elsewhere described as a god. It's not difficult to see this as an allusion to Virgil's 1st Eclogue. Virgil's 1st Eclogue is one of my favourite Latin poems, It was all downhill from there for Virgil, in my view. It features two herdsmen, Tityrus and Meliboeus. The latter is going into exile, the former is chilling in newfound prosperity, which seems to be somehow connected to the presence at Rome of a young man, a Euenus, who's also described as a god, Deus. Conventional interpretations of Virgil's first eclogue tend to associate this young god in Rome with Augustus, making Virgil's poem a kind of panegyric for the Augustan age, heralding in peace after the upheavals of the final years of the Republic. Virgil's poem is far more subtle and ambivalent than that, but that's beside the point. Rather, the key point is that is how Virgil's eclogue has often been perceived. If we can assume that the pro-Augustan reading of Virgil's Eclogue I was established by Calpurnius' time, then it's reasonable to infer that the Euenus who ushers in the golden age described by Faunus is an emperor too. Indeed, this poem is about to double down hard on the cliches of imperial panegyric to ever more tedious extremes. Quick side point, before we continue with Faunus' song, like I say, 7 extant eclogues are attributed to Calpurnius. 3 of them, the 1st, 5th, and the 7th, all feature direct references to Rome or politics, and all feature Corydon as a character. They're often described as the political eclogues, but enough of that, on with Faunus' song.
While this true god shall rule over the people, the impious war goddess Bellona shall yield, her hands manacled behind her back, stripped of arms, forced to chew ravenous upon her entrails, and against herself she shall wage civil war, with which she but recently cursed the whole world. No longer shall Rome weep over battles such as Philippi. No longer shall Rome lead the triumphal procession, though herself a captive. All wars shall be confined to the jails of Tartarus, heads buried in darkness, fearing the light. Fair peace shall be present, fair no longer in countenance alone, as so often she was when absent declared war, distant enemies subdued. She spread dissident strife, with dissident arms and a concealed blade.
Yeah, you know the drill. The reign of a new emperor will bring peace and prosperity, etc., etc., etc. If, as many do, we are to place Calpurnius in the reign of Nero, then Faunus' prophecy is usually taken as a poem in praise of the young Emperor Nero's accession after Claudius. But was there anything approaching a civil war during the reign of Claudius, or anything meriting this kind of prophecy? Well, there's nothing too extreme, and indeed that's one of the reasons why several scholars have placed Calpurnius in a later era, say the 3rd century. But Wiseman, in his 1982 paper, enumerates the various competing factions and martial tensions in the reign of Claudius, and concludes that there was a war of sorts, but the war itself lasted only a few days. But though it came to nothing in the end, it had been a very serious and widespread danger, certainly enough allowing for the Virgilian allusion and the pardonable exaggeration of a panegyricist to account for Calpurnius' reference to civil war. But I'm not going to say anything more about the potential parallels and analogues between the imagery of Calpurnius' poem and historical events, not least because I don't want to wed myself too closely to any specific dating of Calpurnius. And also, it's just a poem by a sycophantic poet, so yeah. Back to the poetic imagery. Calpurnius' presentation of the war goddess Bellona, her hands in shackles behind her back and gnawing at her own guts, seems taken from the traditions of Latin epic. Virgil's depiction of Furor, hands likewise tied behind its back in Aeneid I, is too good not to quote. The gates of war, grim with iron and close-fitting bars, shall be closed, and within impious Furor, sitting on savage arms, his hands bound fast behind with 100 brazen knots, shall roar the ghastliness of bloody lips. Virgil doesn't tell us why Furor's lips are bloody. One can guess, of course, but as for Calpurnius, well, he describes Bellona as gnawing upon her own guts. I'm not personally convinced of any precedents for this visceral self-cannibalism, but some scholars, Hubbard and Karakasis amongst them, see this as an allusion to the proem of Lucan's civil war. in sua vitrici conversum viscera dextra, plunging a right hand into one's own guts. So we've had one personification already, Bellona. Well, why not introduce another? Calpurnius' Faunus continues...
And clemency has ordered every sinful pretense of peace be gone, has smashed the crazed weapons of war. No funeral procession of the fettered senate shall make weary the executioner's task. No more shall the wretched curia be empty of senators, yet the prisons full. Bounteous peace shall be upon us, a peace ignorant of drawn blades, bringing back to Latium the reign of Saturn, the reign of Numa, he who first taught the arts of peace to bands exulting in slaughter, still then fervent in the camps of Romulus. Once his men had laid down their arms, he ordered the trumpets resound amongst holy rites, not amongst wars.
I find this reference to the return of the reign of Numa a bit clunky, a bit forced. Numa was one of the very early legendary kings of Rome, and in Ovid's Fasti there are a few encounters between Numa and Faunus, so he's not entirely out of place. But I just find the way the Song of Faunus opens up with a golden age, one of the kind that seems to be drawn from the Hesiodic tradition via Virgil, and then to draw in references to Numa, it just feels like Calpurnius is clunkily drawing together strands of a Hesiodic tradition and a Roman political folk tradition and not quite pulling it off. But anyhow.
No more shall a consul purchase the pretense of fake honours, or mute accept the empty insignia of command, fake power. Instead, the rule of law shall be restored with renewed legitimacy, and shall restore the ways of the forum to its earlier guise, and a kinder god shall dispel an age of oppression. Let each nation exult, those who live down south or up north, in the east or west, those who burn on the equator. Did you not see how for the 20th time night now gleams with a clear sky, and brings forth a comet radiant with the light of peace? How bright it twinkles, no portent of slaughter. Yet doth it splatter each pole with bloody fire, as once was customary, or shine its light with burning blood? Nay, it is nothing like that comet which, when Caesar had been snatched away, declared deadly war for wretched citizens.
Yeah, comets, omens, Caesar, Claudius, I know, no comment. I just want to get the end of Faunus' song.
Indeed, the god himself shall bear in his strong arms the uncrushed burden of the state of Rome. Nor shall the crash of a world in transition thunder out loud, nor shall Rome deem her deceased to have earned the title of gods, ere the dawn of one age looks back upon the dusk of another.
And that concludes Faunus' song. The god shall bear in his strong arms the uncrushed burden of the state of Rome, pondera molis inconcussa. A few lines back, Faunus referred to the legendary Roman king Numa. Ovid uses a similar phrase in respect of Numa in Book 15 of the Metamorphoses. Meanwhile, a ruler is sought, able to sustain the burden of state, same words as Faunus, Calpurnius, pondera molis, and to succeed so great a king. Fame, herald of truth, selects illustrious Numa for the throne. And by pondera inconcussa, uncrushed burden or weights. Sorry, I really should grow up here, but I can't help but form a ridiculous image of the new god emperor carrying the uncrushed balls of Rome in his arms. Sorry, but I can't help it. That's just what the words mean. Remember Attis in Catullus 63. Devolsit ille acuto sibi pondera silicae. He tore away his balls with a sharp flint. Yeah, I'm sure that's not the image that Calpurnius had in his mind when he wrote this, but I wouldn't put it past Ovid. Indeed, in Book 15 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Ovid increasingly moves away from Greek myths into Roman folk culture, history, and eventually contemporary politics. And he covers a lot of the same ground and alludes to many of the same texts and folk traditions as Calpurnius does in his Song of Faunus. I've not given too much thought to Book 15 of Ovid for many years, perhaps something I must do one day, but I kind of like the idea of Ovid making puerile references to the pondera molis of Rome in his anarchic, subtly disrespectful take of Roman historical and imperial traditions, and then Calpurnius coming along and unwittingly using that same phrase in all sycophantic seriousness. Hey, I don't know, I've got no grounds for this, I'm just being puerile. But in any case, even if you don't take it as far as that, I think that the cross allusions in Calpurnius to Ovid are interesting, and I'm not sure whether Ovid and Calpurnius are independently reacting to the same or similar source material, or whether Calpurnius is responding to Ovid. All other things being equal, the latter, Calpurnius would surely have been familiar with Ovid's work. I can't help but see Ovid and Calpurnius in contrast to each other. Both came after Virgil, though Ovid was a younger contemporary, Calpurnius a few generations or centuries later. Both poets respond to the texts of Virgil, and Calpurnius primarily in response to Virgil's Eclogues, Ovid primarily in response to the Aened. But Calpurnius was in awe of Virgil, and his responses are deeply inferior. Ovid, on the other hand, gave zero fucks and produces something far more superior to the Aeneid. But that's a whole other subject for a whole other time. And side note, whilst I'm banging on about Ovid, can anyone explain why the kids on social media seem to hate Ovid? Maybe he's just too anarchic and doesn't take himself seriously enough. That certainly put him out of favour with other generations, maybe with the kids too today. I don't know. But enough on Ovid for now, back to Calpurnius. The Song of Faunus has ended, and the Eclogue itself ends in classic frame style, with a short dialogue between the two herdsmen with whom it started.
Ornitus, now I'm all a-quiver, as if inspired by the god himself, and terror mixed with joy has come all over me. But now let us praise the bounteous divinity of eloquent Faunus. Let's sing the songs which the god himself brought to us with his singing, and set them to smooth pipe music. Perhaps Meliboeus might take them to an august audience.
The lads decide to make a song about it. There's got to be something meta here. Fake imaginary shepherds finding written text of a god upon a tree, then deciding to set it to music and to sing it. It's always meta. Pastoral poetry is full of these kind of metapoetics. When I was a kid, I thought that was cool and interesting, without quite ever being able to articulate to myself why. Now it just feels a bit cliched to me. I'm minded to think about how, I don't know when it was, but say in the late noughties perhaps, pop culture started getting all very meta like that, breaking the fourth wall and so on in a manner which had already been established in literature and theatre over the later years of the 20th century. At first it might have been cute and quirky, but now it's become such a tiresome cliche of modern pop culture, right? So if Theocritus, who was the real founder of the pastoral tradition, is 1980s postmodernism, then Calpurnius is 2020s Disney/MCU or whatever. That's what I'm saying. But now on that train of thought, who's the ancient South Park? Ovid, I guess. What do you think? Anyway, there's 6 more Eclogues where that came from. Don't know if I'll ever bring myself to getting around to doing them, but hey. So, meantime, like and subscribe, and we'll be back in due course.